Hello, reading friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This book was originally published back in 1927, and I listened to a 2012 Audible edition narrated by Nicole Kidman. So, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I've been wanting to read this actually for several years. I read Mrs. Dalloway a few years ago and I chatted that here on my channel. So I will link to that chat down in the details below. But I've been meaning to get to the Lighthouse ever since. So I decided this year was definitely going to have to be the year for me to get To the Lighthouse read. So yeah, this book is, very Virginia Woolf, meaning it doesn't have that much of a plot and not that much of character development. It's really kind of a consciousness book, and we learn about the characters populating this book through the consciousnesses of others. So I'll talk a bit more about that here in a bit. But the book itself is divided into three different parts. The first part is called The Window. The second part is called Time Passes. And then the third part is called The Lighthouse. So this first part, The Window, our main sort of characters, if we can call them that, the people populating this book, are Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. They have a vacation home on the Isle of Skye in the Hebrides of Scotland. And so they are there over a summer, and they have some guests there. First of all, they are a married couple. They have 8 children of various ages, the youngest of whom is James. So James actually, Mrs. Ramsay thinks about him a lot, because what we're actually experiencing here are the thoughts of these different characters as they relate to their past, their present here at this summer house, with the other people that are around them, the other characters, and then just also about them, their sort of hopes and dreams sometimes, and what they think about. So Mrs. Ramsay actually spends quite a bit of time thinking about her youngest James. But some of the other people here at this summer house is Charles Tansley, who is a student. Mr. Ramsay is a academic of some kind, like a philosopher, I believe, in philosophy. Charles Tansley is also an academic. And then Miss Lily Briscoe is an artist. She's there, a youngish woman. Then there are Paul, what's his last name? Paul Rayleigh is there with his, I guess, girlfriend, eventual fiance, Minta. They are there. And then Mr. Carmichael, Augustus Carmichael, is a poet. And he is there. So this first part, the window, called The Window, really it takes place over the course of a couple of days. They're going to have they're all assembled at this summer house, like I mentioned. They're sort of planning an expedition to the lighthouse. There is a lighthouse off the coast that can be accessed by boat, and they're sort of planning a sort of an excursion to the lighthouse the following day. The youngest son, James, is looking forward to this very much, actually. But then there's some question of whether or not they're actually going to be able to go to the lighthouse. Mr. Ramsay ultimately says they're not going to be able to go because the weather's not going to be fine. Mrs. Ramsay then kind of frets about that because she feels like James is going to be disappointed. Let me stop here. I meant to mention earlier about spoilers. This is not a book that we need to worry so much about spoilers, because there's not a plot, like I mentioned, per se. So what we're really experiencing are these characters' consciousnesses as they think about what's going on around them. Kind of the highlight for me of this part 1 was a dinner party that occurs towards the end of part 1. And this dinner party was just so magical in the way that Virginia Woolf was able to take us around this table through the thoughts of everybody at this dinner party and what's going on at the dinner party. It's just really run-of-the-mill, everyday kind of things. Like, for example, Augustus Carmichael asks for an extra bowl of soup, and this annoys Mr. Ramsay, and then others notice that. But we know this through their inner dialogue that they're having. So I jotted down, as I was reading this, a couple emotions that I had throughout the entire book was how hypnotic it was and how dreamlike the whole thing seemed to me. Like I mentioned, I did listen to this edition by Nicole Kidman, and she read this. I actually slowed it down slightly because the words are so beautiful. It's so beautifully written. I just wanted to drink it in and just absorb it because it was so beautiful and so sort of magical in a way, and really definitely hypnotic and dreamlike. This sort of experience of experiencing a reality through others, through the consciousness of others, and how they're all separated from each other. And I'll talk a bit more about that here in a bit. But to talk to describe a little bit about part 2 and then part 3. Part 2 is called Time Passes. So part 1 ends and then time passes. Part 2 jumps in. Some time has passed. Some of the characters have actually passed away at this point. We discover we're not, none of the characters who exist in part 1 speak in part 2. Part 2 is kind of like a universal narrator, I guess, an omniscient narrator, but we learn about what's happened. We do hear the thoughts of the housekeeper because no one's at the vacation home and no one has been there for quite some time. For one, there's been World War I has intervened, and one of the characters actually passes away in World War I, but other characters have passed away. So the family and their friends have not returned to this vacation home in quite some time. And so this section to me was really sort of a musing on change and impermanence. And, the houses, since it has not been visited, even though they kind of keep it up, the garden's overgrown. And, we know from the first part, Mrs. Ramsay was somewhat obsessive about the garden. And the house itself is fallen into somewhat disrepair. And the woman who's sort of been in charge of overseeing it to sort of a high-level oversight, the family doesn't really doesn't follow up, and so the house is just in disrepair, and she wonders if anybody's ever going to visit it again, or if the house is just going to eventually collapse and be reclaimed by nature. So that section really is that sort of musing. And then the third part is called The Lighthouse. So this third part is about 10 years after the events of part 1. And during this part, the surviving members, Mr. Ramsay and some of the children, as well as Lily Briscoe, the painter, and Mr. Carmichael, I believe, and another guest. Anyway, they returned to the Lighthouse this summer. It's been about 10 years since the event in part 1, and things have changed. And so we really understand this and how this changed. The deaths of some of the characters have impacted some of the other characters. And then ultimately, though, in this part, sort of the highlight of it, I think, is that this trip actually happens to the lighthouse. There is a little small expedition that goes off to the lighthouse. Meanwhile, our artist friend Lily, she stays behind and paints, actually completes the painting that she began in the first part. It's just so beautiful. So a couple of thoughts and themes, a few here. It's just the singularity and the complexity of our each individual consciousness. I wrote that down as sort of a main theme that I took away from this. How complex we all are as people, and in our inner dialogue, how that jumps around, sometimes completely sort of irrelevant to what's going on around us. We're thinking about something completely different, but no one around us really knows this, and how we have a really difficult time to actually know each other. Even Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, a couple at this point in their middle age who have had 8 children, they know each other pretty well, all things considered, but how they don't technically, we can't actually know the inner life of another. Um, and so I also jotted down how complicated our relations are, and what we can say can really do either be a tremendous comfort to someone, something just said offhand, or hurt someone, maybe unintentionally, maybe not. Or in part one, Charles Tansley mentions offhand to Lily Briscoe that women can't paint, so that it just shatters her confidence that she's about her painting that she's been doing, and she's really, she lacks self confidence about her painting anyway, and she carries that throughout the whole course of later on, even 10 years later, when she revisits this vacation home, she remembers that occurrence. Another thing I jotted down is, what does the lighthouse mean? I'm still thinking about this. The lighthouse to me feels like a symbol for something. Is it our individual consciousnesses as a lighthouse? Is it God or a divine presence? Or is it some sort of ultimate goal, like a life's journey? I'm still not exactly sure. So if anybody's read this and they have any thoughts about if the lighthouse, maybe it symbolizes nothing at all, but I'm just curious what others might think about what the symbolism of the lighthouse might be, or maybe there's no symbol there at all, and I'm just reading more into it than is there. But it seems to me like it's a symbol for something. Finally, final thought is how the final kind of thing I took away mainly from the book was how transient life is, how impermanent everything is. And these moments of time that we see, these moments of thoughts, this moment in time that's captured especially in the first part of the book, but also in the third part of the book, is how bittersweet that is, how beautiful it is, but how fleeting and transient it is. And I'm going to close on a quote about this. This is as Mrs. Ramsay is leaving the room of the dinner party in part one that I mentioned. She has this quote that I think really illustrates this impermanence, about how each moment of our consciousness is constantly dropping away into the past. And so she's leaving the dinner party. She says, "It was necessary now to carry everything a step further. With her foot on the threshold, she waited a moment longer in a scene which was vanishing even as she looked. And then, as she moved and took Minta's arm and left the room, it changed. It shaped itself differently. It had become, she knew, giving one last look at it over her shoulder, already the past." So beautiful there. Beautiful, beautiful writing. This is why you would want to read this book or listen to this book, is just this beautiful writing and this description of this inner world of these characters. So I will stop the chat there. My next chat is going to be The Proper Study of Mankind, an anthology of essays by Isaiah Berlin. I'm making my way through this. Not necessarily an easy read, but I'm making my way through it, and I should have a chat on this coming up fairly soon. So until next time, take care. Bye.